3 crowns refused, a bed of frozen stone, bare feet bleeding upon the snow of Krakow. While all of Europe conspired for thrones, a 25-year-old heir chose to die a virgin rather than betray a secret vow. The year of our Lord, 1458. The European continent struggles between 2 worlds, the twilight of the Middle Ages and the first glimmers of the Renaissance. Constantinople has fallen barely 5 years before, and Islam advances inexorably toward the heart of Christendom. On this chessboard where kings and emperors move their pieces with calculated ambition, there exists a kingdom stretching from the Baltic coasts to the steppes bordering the Sultan's domains. Poland and Lithuania, united under the scepter of the Jagiellons, stand as a bastion of the Catholic faith in Eastern Europe. Their court in Krakow rivals in splendor those of Paris and Vienna. There, within stone walls that have witnessed coronations and conspiracies, a queen of Habsburg blood prays each night for the child she carries in her womb. No one in that golden palace could imagine that the child yet to be born would write his name in the book of saints, not with sword nor with crown, but with wounded knees and a heart consumed by divine love. On the 3rd of October, 1458, the skies over Cracovia turned a leaden gray, while the bells of Wawel Cathedral rang out, announcing a royal birth. In the most sheltered chambers of the castle, Queen Isabel de Habsburgo held her 3rd son for the first time. They named him Casimir, like his father, the powerful king who ruled a territory vaster than France and Spain combined. The blood coursing through that newborn's veins was a compendium of European nobility. Through his father's line, the Jagiellonis, the Lithuanian dynasty that had carried the cross of Christ to the last pagan lands of the continent. Through his mother's line, the Habsburgo, whose imperial eagles loomed over half the known world. That child's destiny seemed written in golden ink. He would be king, conqueror, forger of alliances that would redraw the map of Europe. But Queen Elizabeth harbored other plans in her heart. This woman of indomitable character and profound piety had been educated in the most refined court of the Holy Roman Empire, where she learned that earthly crowns rust while heavenly ones shine eternally. When her ladies-in-waiting asked what she wished for her children, she invariably replied that they be saints before kings. With Casimir, from the very first moment, the queen sensed that God had granted her a singular soul. While his older brothers wailed, demanding the wet nurse's breast, little Casimir remained strangely serene, with dark eyes that seemed to contemplate invisible realities. The queen personally assumed the early religious education of all her 13 children, but with Casimir, she devoted additional hours, reading him the lives of the martyrs, teaching him to make the sign of the cross, whispering the words of the Hail Mary into his ear before he could even pronounce them. At 7 years old, the prince's formal education was entrusted to Canon Jan Długosz, the kingdom's official chronicler and one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Długosz had written the history of Poland in 12 monumental volumes. He knew every intrigue, every battle, every treaty that had forged that nation. His mission was to prepare the Jagiellonis princes for the art of governing. However, from the very first lessons, the canon detected something in Casimir that deeply unsettled him. While his brothers yawned during theology classes and grew impatient for riding exercises, this child with the penetrating gaze devoured the texts of St. Augustine and St. Thomas, with a hunger that Długosz had only seen in the most fervent novices of the monasteries. The prince posed questions that would have honored a doctor of the Sorbonne, about the nature of grace, about the mystery of the Eucharist, about the meaning of human suffering. Długos would write years later that teaching Casimir was like trying to fill an ocean with a bucket of water. The prince's soul had an infinite capacity for the divine. The servants of the Cracovia palace began to weave stories about the little prince. They told how they had found him on his knees in the royal chapel, at hours when other children his age played in the gardens. They recounted how he distributed among the beggars at the castle gate the sweets and coins he received as gifts. They whispered that once, during a royal hunt, Casimir had strayed from the retinue to kneel beside a wounded deer, praying for the animal while tears streamed down his cheeks. King Casimir IV listened to these reports with growing unease. An heir needed to be strong, cunning, ruthless if necessary. Excessive piety was proper for monks, not for princes destined to command armies. But when he tried to reprimand his son, he found himself met with a gaze of such purity and obedience so perfect that words of reproach died on his lips. The boy did not argue, did not rebel. He simply continued being who he was, with a meekness that disarmed all opposition. By the age of 10, Casimir had learned to live in two simultaneous worlds. He fulfilled his princely duties impeccably, rode horses with skill, handled the sword with competence, conducted himself at banquets with the dignity his rank demanded. But his true life unfolded on another plane, in that interior space where only he and God dwelled, where crowns meant nothing, and the only throne that mattered was that of the slain lamb. The year 1471 marked the abrupt end of Casimir's childhood. A delegation of Hungarian nobles arrived in Krakow with a proposal that electrified the court. They offered the crown of St. Stephen to the young Polish prince, weary of Matthias Corvinus's rule. For King Casimir IV, this was the opportunity he had awaited for decades. Hungary, Christendom's shield against the Ottoman advance, would fall under Jagiellonian influence. Without even consulting his 13-year-old son's opinion, the monarch ordered an army of 12,000 men, assembled and placed at the head of this enterprise a boy who had barely left his tutor's classroom. The Hungarian campaign was a baptism of fire and ashes. Casimir rode for weeks along muddy roads, sleeping in campaign tents while the Carpathian wind howled like a starving beast. The generals who were supposedly guiding him treated him as a living banner, a symbol to wave before the troops, while they made military decisions with an incompetence that bordered on criminal. The support promised by the Hungarian magnates evaporated like morning dew under the sun. Matthias Corvinus had purchased their loyalty with gold and threats. When the first winter snows began to fall, the Polish army undertook a humiliating retreat, leaving behind a trail of dead, deserters, and shattered hopes. But in the heart of that defeated adolescent, a seed was germinating that no one had consciously planted. During those endless nights of forced march, surrounded by blasphemous soldiers and venal generals, Casimir had beheld the true face of earthly power. He had seen how men tore each other apart for a throne that tomorrow another would occupy. He had smelled the blood of peasants massacred in the name of dynastic disputes they would never understand. He had heard the laments of the dying calling for their mothers while the crows waited patiently. And in the midst of that horror, kneeling in the mud of an anonymous battlefield, the prince had experienced a certainty that pierced him like lightning. There existed another kingdom, invisible to carnal eyes, where the only weapon was love and the only conquest, total surrender. When Casimir crossed through the gates of Krakow, those who had bid him farewell as a conqueror in the making received a transformed young man. His face had lost the softness of childhood, but his eyes burned with a light that had nothing to do with frustrated ambition. The following months were ones of silent metamorphosis. The prince fulfilled his courtly obligations with a correctness that no one could fault, but every free moment he devoted to prayer with an intensity that alarmed physicians and confessors alike. He began fasting 3 days a week, nourishing himself only on bread and water. He gave away his princely wardrobe to the city's poor, keeping only the garments indispensable for official ceremonies. The servants who prepared his bed found it untouched each morning, while the prince slept on the bare floor of his chamber, using as a pillow a log wrapped in cloth. It was then that he began the practice that would become legend. Each night, when the palace sank into silence, Casimir would stealthily leave his chambers and descend through the castle's frozen corridors, his bare feet upon stones that the Polish winter transformed into blocks of ice. He would cross courtyards where frost crunched beneath his bloodied soles until he reached the locked doors of Wawel Cathedral. There he remained prostrate until the canons opened the temple for the dawn matins. The night guards at first tried to stop him. Later, they learned to step aside in silence, crossing themselves before that spectacle of devotion that surpassed their understanding. The definitive crisis erupted when the king proposed to his son a marriage with a daughter of Emperor Frederick III of Habsburg. It was a dazzling alliance that would have consolidated Jagiellonian power over half of Europe. Casimir, with a serenity that contrasted with his father's fury, declined the offer. He had consecrated his virginity to God through a private vow that no human power could dissolve. The king roared, threatened, pleaded. The royal counselors attempted to reason with the prince, explaining that marriage was a sacrament, not a sin. But Casimir remained immovable as a rock battered by waves. He did not despise Christian marriage. Simply, God had shown him another path, narrower and more luminous. He had rejected a crown in Hungary. Now he rejected the marriage bed. The world offered its most precious treasures, and the prince returned them with empty hands, because his hands were already full of a treasure that the world could neither see nor comprehend. Lithuania welcomed its new viceroy in the autumn of 1479. King Casimir IV, having exhausted every strategy to bend his son's will, had opted for exile disguised as honor. If the prince insisted on living like a monk, let him at least govern those remote lands where his eccentricity would cause less scandal. Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, was then a city of brutal contrasts, where the golden domes of Orthodox churches competed with the Gothic spires of Catholic temples, where Jewish merchants traded alongside Russian boyars, and where the border with the Tartar hordes felt dangerously close. The Lithuanian nobles, accustomed to viceroys who plundered public coffers and abused their authority with absolute impunity, watched skeptically as that 20-year-old young man arrived, whose reputation for sanctity seemed to them at best a courtly exaggeration. The first months of Casimir's government disarmed his most bitter critics. The prince demonstrated an administrative intelligence that no one had suspected beneath his appearance of a self-absorbed mystic. He personally reviewed the treasury accounts, detecting frauds that had been embedded in the bureaucracy for decades. He presided over tribunals with an impartiality that scandalized those who expected favors due to their rank or wealth. When magnates attempted to bribe him with sumptuous gifts, Casimir politely refused them and directed their value to the city's hospitals. A chronicler of the time wrote that governing with Casimir was like governing with an angel who had studied law. His justice was relentless but never cruel, his mercy abundant but never naive. The Lithuanian peasants began calling him the Prince of the Poor because he was the first who listened to their complaints without demanding additional tribute for the privilege of being heard. But the fiercest battle Casimir waged did not unfold in council halls or in the farmlands devastated by Tatar raids. It was a secret war, fought in the silence of his chamber, against enemies only he could see. The testimonies gathered during his canonization process reveal a life of penance that would have made the anchorites of the Egyptian desert grow pale. Beneath the silk vestments that protocol required, the prince concealed a hair shirt that lacerated his flesh with every movement. The nights he did not spend prostrate before the doors of some church he devoted to flagellating himself with a knotted cord discipline, offering each blow for the conversion of sinners and the liberation of souls from purgatory. He slept barely 3 hours, and always on bare boards covered with a threadbare blanket. His confessor, an elderly Franciscan who had witnessed many forms of holiness, declared years later that he had never encountered a soul so thirsty for purification nor so relentless with itself. Casimir's Marian devotion reached during these years a depth that bordered on the mystical. The prince had adopted as his favorite prayer the Latin hymn Omni Die Dic Mariae, a medieval composition that exalted the glories of the Virgin in stanzas of rapturous beauty. Every day without exception, Casimir recited this hymn in full, often several times, with a devotion that transformed the words into fire. The courtiers who surprised him in these moments of prayer described his face as transfigured, as if he were contemplating realities forbidden to mortal eyes. The manuscript of the hymn, copied in his own hand on the finest parchment, accompanied him everywhere, on journeys through the territory, in audiences with ambassadors, during nights of vigil. It was his shield against temptations, his consolation in tribulations, his love letter to the mother he had chosen as queen of his virginal heart. Meanwhile, tuberculosis advanced silently through his lungs like an invading army that knows no mercy. The court physicians watched helplessly as that young man of already fragile constitution wasted away between intermittent fevers and coughing fits that left crimson stains on his handkerchiefs. They prescribed absolute rest. Casimir intensified his fasts. They recommended fortifying wines and substantial meats. The prince reduced his diet to black bread and spring water. When a particularly bold physician suggested that carnal relations might restore the balance of his humors, Casimir looked at him with those eyes that seemed to contemplate eternity and spoke the words that would seal his fate. "I would rather die than sin." There was no defiance in his voice, nor pride, nor even resignation. Only the serene certainty of one who has found a treasure for which it is worth surrendering one's entire life. The winter of 1483 descended upon Lithuania with a ferocity that the elders could not recall ever witnessing before. The rivers became roads of ice, wolves came down from the forests to the very gates of Vilnius, and in the most sheltered chamber of the castle, a 25-year-old prince waged his final battle against an enemy that knew no defeat. Tuberculosis had completed its work of silent destruction. Casimir's lungs, ravaged by years of extreme fasting and nights of vigil upon frozen stones, could barely extract enough air to keep the flame of that extraordinary life burning. The physicians attending him had abandoned all hope of cure. Now they only administered balms to ease the pain and herbal infusions to calm the cough that tore at his chest like iron claws. The prince listened to them with patience, thanked them for their care with genuine gratitude, and then asked to be left alone to continue his prayers. News of Casimir's grave condition spread through the kingdom like wildfire in a dry summer. From the most remote corners of Lithuania, messengers arrived asking about the health of the viceroy who had governed the powerful with justice and the humble with mercy. Peasants lit candles in rural churches, offering their humble prayers for that prince who had never looked down upon them. The nobles who years before had murmured against his excessive piety now kept an ashamed silence, understanding too late that they had been privileged to be governed by a saint. Queen Elizabeth undertook the journey from Krakow, defying the storms and impassable roads, determined to hold her son's hand in his final passage. When she arrived in Vilnius, she found Casimir bedridden but serene, his face gaunt from illness, yet illuminated by a peace that transcended all human understanding. Mother and son spent hours in silent conversation, communicating through glances what words could not express. The final days of February 1484 were ones of physical agony, but absolute spiritual clarity. Casimir asked to receive the last sacraments in full consciousness, not as a dying man clinging to rituals out of fear of the hereafter, but as a pilgrim who finally glimpses the towers of the holy city after a long journey. The Bishop of Vilnius personally administered extreme unction, and the witnesses present swore that when the Eucharist touched the prince's lips, his face was transfigured with a radiance that no lamp could produce. Casimir spent his last conscious hours asking forgiveness from each person who entered his chamber, blessing servants and nobles alike, consoling those who came to console him. To his mother he whispered not to weep, that soon they would be reunited in a kingdom where separations and tears did not exist. To the priests surrounding him, he asked that they continue praying the Omni Dei Dic Mariae, his beloved hymn, so that the last words he heard in this world would be praises to the Virgin, who had guided him since the cradle. The dawn of March 4th, 1484, found Casimir suspended between two worlds. His breathing had become so faint that those keeping vigil by his bedside had to lean in to verify he still lived. Outside, the first light of day tinged the perpetual snows covering Vilnius with pink. Inside the chamber, a sacred silence enveloped those present, like an invisible mantle. Shortly before the sun fully appeared above the horizon, the prince opened his eyes one last time. Those closest to him claimed his lips moved, forming a name, perhaps Mary, perhaps Jesus, perhaps both merged into a single invocation of love. Then he exhaled softly, like one falling asleep after a long day's work, and his soul departed that body he had mortified with such rigor to fly into the arms of the bridegroom he had chosen since childhood. Those present remained motionless for long minutes, overcome by the certainty of having witnessed not a death, but a birth. An inexplicable fragrance, like lilies and roses in the depths of winter, permeated the room. The light streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, bathing the deceased prince's face with a luminosity that did not come from the rising sun. Casimir of Poland had lived 25 years, 4 months, and 1 day. He had rejected 3 earthly crowns to wear the only one that truly mattered. And on that March dawn, while the world awoke to its daily concerns, a prince who had chosen to be a servant entered triumphant into the heavenly Jerusalem. Casimir's tomb in the Cathedral of Vilnius became almost immediately a magnet for souls thirsting for wonders. Barely weeks had passed since his burial when the first testimonies of extraordinary graces began to arrive. A paralyzed child who recovered movement in his legs after being brought before the prince's sepulchre, a blind woman who regained her sight while praying beside his relics, a Lithuanian sailor who survived a shipwreck invoking Casimir's name amid the raging waters. The cathedral canons, initially skeptical of these accounts that sprang forth like springs after rainfall, began to meticulously record each case, aware that they were witnessing the dawn of a cult that would transcend borders and centuries. The fame of the saintly prince spread along the Baltic trade routes, through the pilgrimage roads that crossed Central Europe, through the courts where Polish ambassadors proudly recounted the story of that heir who had preferred the crown of martyrdom to all earthly diadems. The canonization process, initiated just a few years after Casimir's death, gathered testimonies that painted the portrait of a flawless sanctity. Nobles and peasants, bishops and servants, all agreed in describing a young man whose life had been a continuous prayer, whose charity knew no limits, whose purity shone as a challenge to the corruption of his era. Pope Leo X, after examining the evidence presented, solemnly proclaimed the canonization in 1521, raising to the altars the first saint of Lithuania and the patron of Christian youth. The papal bull especially highlighted his heroic virginity, that decision to preserve his body intact as a temple of the Holy Spirit, rejecting advantageous marriages and medical treatments that would have compromised his vow. In a Europe shaken by the Protestant Reformation, where the relics of saints were being burned and their images destroyed, Casimir emerged as a luminous testimony that Catholic holiness continued to flourish in lands that remained faithful to Rome. The year 1604 brought forth a prodigy that definitively consolidated veneration of the saintly prince. When ecclesiastical authorities ordered the exhumation of his remains to transfer them to a chapel more worthy of his memory, those present stood petrified before what they discovered. Casimir's body lay incorrupt, as if death had respected that flesh which its owner had mortified with such rigor. The skin retained its flexibility, the features remained recognizable, and between the hands crossed upon his chest rested the manuscript of the Omni Dei Dic Mariae, perfectly preserved after 120 years beneath the earth. This hymn to the Virgin, which Casimir had recited every day of his adult life, became his spiritual signature, the written testimony of a love that not even the grave had been able to extinguish. The multitudes who came to behold this wonder returned to their homes transformed, carrying with them the certainty that heaven had ratified the sanctity of that prince who had chosen to be last in order to become first. Through the turbulent centuries that followed, Saint Casimir remained a beacon of hope for the peoples who had seen him born and govern. When Poland was partitioned among foreign powers and Lithuania fell under the Tsarist yoke, the faithful would secretly visit his chapel in Vilnius, asking for the liberation of their oppressed homelands. When Nazi and Soviet armies devastated those lands in the 20th century, Casimir's name was whispered in concentration camps and gulags as an invocation of spiritual resistance. In 1948, Pope Pius XII proclaimed him patron of all Catholic youth, recognizing that his example of purity, prayer, and service was especially needed in a world that had forgotten the value of sacrifice. Today, when the cathedrals of Krakow and Vilnius receive pilgrims from every continent, the prince who rejected crowns continues to reign from heaven, interceding for those who seek the strength to choose the eternal over the fleeting, the invisible over the apparent, the love that never dies over pleasures that vanish like smoke in the wind. What crown are we chasing while the true treasure awaits in the silence of our heart? Casimir confronts us with the question that the modern world refuses to ask. If everything we possess vanished tomorrow, what would remain? This prince discovered that knees worn raw on frozen stone led to a throne higher than any golden seat, that bare feet bleeding in the snow trace the path toward a homeland where winter of the soul does not exist, that a body consumed by fasting can harbor a fire that not even death can extinguish. In those nights of Krakow and Vilnius, prostrate before locked doors, while the world slept chasing dreams of power, Casimir understood the secret that the wise of this age will never decipher. That true freedom does not consist in having everything, but in needing nothing that God does not wish to give us. that authentic nobility does not reside in inherited blood, but in blood poured out for love. That to truly reign means to serve until the last breath, until the last drop of strength, until the heart utters its final praise. Today, when so many voices seduce us with promises of instant happiness and crowns that rust before dawn, the Prince of Lithuania stands beside us, pointing upward with his finger, consumed by illness, yet radiant with glory. He does not ask us to abandon the world, but to pass through it without letting the world pass through us. He does not demand that we reject crowns, because perhaps they will never be offered to us, but that we seek first that kingdom where neither moth corrupts nor thief breaks in. Every day speak with Mary, he whispers to us from his incorrupt tomb, Omni die dic Mariae, and she will lead you, as she led him, into the eternal arms of the Father. Saint Casimir of Poland, Virgin Prince and Patron of Youth, pray for us.